is a gift that's being shared with the world. People can come here and begin to understand and to learn about our way of life, our rich history, how we lived on the land, and how we survived. But we all know the devastating effects that history has and the impact that it has had on our people, and also our valuable resources that come from the land. But SNAP is like a university that's been left behind for our people. And this is one way as to how we can continue our practices, our ceremonies, and even our language, based on what our ancestors had left behind for us. They always say, the ones in the future are going to continue to understand and to preserve our way of life, which is very important to us. And it's happening today. Sinape is a place where you can come and really enjoy the beauty of the land. Also to enjoy what Mother Earth, we call Na'ak, Sahakumitapiaki, has to offer. That's really important for our people. And all people to come here. I feel that this is a wonderful place to be, to really enjoy the land, to enjoy the gifts that have been left here for us, and also to begin to understand a way of life that has existed for thousands of years. All of our resources, especially the buffalo, are all coming back. A lot of our nations now have the buffaloes on their lands. And I truly believe that is one way as to how we can continue our way of survival. Even the animal itself teaches us a lot about who we are and how we've lived in the past. And this is where the ancestors would record their way of life, experiences, journeys, and ceremonies, and how we existed with all people. With the messages that are left behind, we always identify what we call the being of the land, Niwa, the buffalo. And in here it continually acknowledges a way of life and the importance and the significance of that animal and what it meant to our ancestors, because that provided everything that was needed. Food, shelter, clothing, tools and weapons, and all the things that we needed for survival basically came from that one animal. Now, just seeing the image of the buffalo, again, that demonstrates that this was probably a good hunt, very successful. And this is how they would record all of the gifts that they get from the land and how successful our people were in hunting the beings of the land. And this is how they would record that. And if you see that, it's a huge animal compared to what others that you see on the stone. But just seeing the buffalo itself, we also learn from the animal. But what's really important is the respect that we have for the animal. Our way of life is that we only take exactly all what we need, because we always have to ensure that we leave some behind for other people to survive. And that is our way of life, is to always share and to coexist. So this would clearly demonstrate that this was a good time in their life. And that's why we see that image today.
This is Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump. It's one of the premier buffalo jumps in all of North America. It's perhaps the largest and longest used of all jumps, although that's still somewhat debated. But it is certainly a premier example of this type of hunting technique that was developed by North American indigenous people and used for thousands and thousands of years. The story of the buffalo jump, I think, is one of the amazing stories of how indigenous people settled this land and made a living from it in ways that we could seldom fathom today. They were just incredibly clever, sophisticated, and ingenious methods of hunting bison. Remember, hunting bison was a mainstay of native life for thousands of years. They did it in all kinds of ways that involved using tricks and traps to mire these animals in deep pits to get them crossing rivers, to catch them in snowdrifts, to lure them into canyons and gullies and arroyos, and of course, most spectacularly, to drive them over a cliff. That was just one of the ways that they killed large numbers of animals, but it was perhaps the most dramatic and cinematic of all of them. It is a fabulous thing to ponder how this all transpired and to imagine yourself on the edge of a cliff thousands of years ago and watch one of these would have really been something to behold. We think the buffalo jumps involved very large numbers of animals. We don't think they drove 5, 10, or 15 towards a cliff, because the evidence suggests that had they done that, they in fact would not kill any of them. Buffalo jumps required fairly large numbers of herd, or large herd size, probably in the range of 50, 75 to 100 animals at any one time. The idea is that you need this relatively dense pack of animals running towards the cliff in order for the jump to work at all. It's the grouping of them together in this dense unit that pushes the leaders over the cliff. Otherwise, they would see the danger at some point and they would stop. But the ones running behind them, blind to the existence of the cliff, are going to push the leaders over the edge. And that's really the key to how buffalo jump worked. And with 5 or 10 animals, you're not going to get that effect. The animals will simply see the danger. They're very agile. They don't look like it. They look big and lumbering, but they're very agile on their feet. They can turn on a dime, and they would break through the ranks of people, and no doubt some people would be lost, either pushed over the cliff or trampled by these animals. So the people understood that, and they knew that they had to drive large numbers at any one time to the edge of a cliff. Organizing a buffalo jump would have been an incredible piece of work. You would have needed hundreds of people at any one time, and you would have many, many chores assigned to those people, all of these things that need to be done in advance of a kill. For example, some people would be in the campsite here on the flats below the cliff, and they would be gathering up buffalo dung and wood for fires that they're going to need for all the cooking and processing of the carcasses. Other people would be going back into the gathering basin behind the jump, where the animals are collecting, in order to round them up and start moving them towards the cliff for the eventual kill. Other people would be in the gathering basin building what we call these drive lane cairns. And these are long lines of stone and other material that they build and compile into these sort of V-shaped funnels. And this is the drive mechanism that they used. They would use brush and dung and rocks and sod, and they would pile these up and make these substantial structures that to the eye of the buffalo, which is not gifted with great vision, they would see these as something in the landscape. They don't know what they are. They don't understand them. They haven't seen them before. And they tend to avoid them. So if you build these in a funnel-shaped fashion, you get the animals between these lanes. It's a fairly good chance that they're going to run down those stone lines, and which of course lead to the cliff, and be driven over the cliff. That was one of the ways the hunters learned how to move these animals, and just exactly how they understood all that and how they learned that over the years. I don't know if we'll ever fully understand that, because it's a remarkable adaptation to animal behavior and biology that most of us would have trouble comprehending today. I don't think we could have come up with those techniques on our own. But they used these in many ways. They had many tricks that they employed to move these game animals. One of them was to dress up as other animals, and this was a favorite decoy technique they would use. They would put the hides of other animals over themselves and then mix in amongst the buffalo herds and get closer to them by doing that. And they would dress up as coyotes, they would dress up as antelope, and of course bison calves was one of the favorite techniques they used. These were called buffalo runners. And it was their job to move in close to the herd and to mingle amongst them and to start to actually move them into the area of the drive lanes, and eventually they could be then pulled towards the cliff. So these people had mastered all the techniques of imitating the sound and the motion of other animals that the bison would be well familiar with, and they would expect to see in their environment, like pronghorn antelope or coyotes, and they're used to these and they're expecting to see them. And then the hunters, who are disguised as these other animals, knew all the tricks of then luring the animals to make them follow them. For example, one of their tricks was to pretend to be a lost bison calf that's been separated from its family. These are very strong family groups that bison lived in, and if a cow felt that its calf had wandered away and it didn't know where it was at any one moment, the mother would go looking for it, and it would say, you know, where's my calf? I hear it, but I don't see it. And what the hunters would be doing is moving away from the herd, making the sound of a calf that's been separated from its mother. They had mastered that. We have eyewitnesses from Europeans who saw them do this, and they said, had I not seen the buffalo runner put on that outfit and mix into the herd, I would have shot that individual thinking that it was a buffalo. That gives you a good indication of how perfect these imitations were. It was almost like they transformed into the bison calf. They didn't imitate it. As the buffalo runners lured the animals closer to the cliff, of course it would have gotten a lot more exciting and a lot more dangerous. The animals at first, they would not want them to be running. You don't run bison over a long distance to get them to a buffalo jump, because they'll start to tire out and the herd will start to break apart. The old animals will drop out and the young ones will run ahead, and there'll be a few wounded ones that will limp along. And that's not good for the drive. The drive needs to be this cohesive unit arriving at one time at the cliff, because that's really the key to how all this works. So the actual drive of a stampede is probably quite short, maybe a half a kilometer or something in that range. Just the final stretch leading down the cliff towards the jump. And we know that many buffalo jumps, like Head Smashed In, have a turn near the end. It's very common. There's a bit of a turn in the drive line, and this is done intentionally because it helps hide the trap from the eyes of the buffalo till the very last moment. So they're actually in a bit of a turn as they're approaching the cliff, and it makes it harder for them to see that they're actually walking into a trap. And another common feature at buffalo jumps, and again we see that here at Head Smashed In, is that the downhill run at the end is part of the lay of the land that is most desired by the indigenous people. The downhill run allows the animals to gain speed because they're going downhill. They're front heavy. Bison are, if you picture one in your mind, they're a very front heavy animal, huge heads on them, big humps on the shoulder, massive front quarters. And so it's kind of like a pickup truck going down a hill. It becomes harder and harder to stop as you go down a hill in full run. So the downhill run is an advantage, and it makes it harder for these animals to avoid the trap as well. It also helps hide the fact that there's a trap, because as you're going downhill, what it looks like continuous prairie out in front of you. You don't really see the edge of a cliff as you would if you were going on level land. So these are all things that people searched for when they decided which of the cliffs in their landscape they were going to turn into buffalo jumps. So Head Smashed In has all of these, and that's why it was perhaps the heaviest used and most spectacular of all the jumps that we've ever recorded on the Northern Plains. So you can imagine the sort of controlled chaos of a stampeding herd now coming down the final stretch. People are on both sides of the animals. They're waving and shouting. They're trying to make sure these animals do not break through to the side, come through the drive lines. It would have been a very dangerous situation to be in. Nothing you could have carried in your hand, a spear, a bow, an arrow, nothing would have done you any good if a herd decides to turn and comes towards you. You are completely out of luck. You just have to use everything in your crafty imagination to make sure that doesn't happen. And one of the most important things that people did, at the end of the drive, they would be waving buffalo robes in their own hands. So they would be holding robes, and they're holding it so that the dark hair side is facing in towards the animals, not towards themselves. And that's to create a sense of a wall almost. So this dark hide, one after another on both sides of these drive lines of people waving them, almost makes it look like an impenetrable wall. And we know for a fact that that was relatively effective at keeping bison from charging against these walls. For whatever reason, something psychic in their head, They did not feel comfortable charging against anything that looked solid. And so they respected these and they ran alongside rather than running through these walls of people. And of course that worked to great advantage to the organizers of the jump. And eventually then the animals reached the edge of the cliff. And that's where the most spectacular moments would have occurred. Literally dozens of animals plunging over the cliff to their death, flying through the air, dust flying through the air, the bellowing and the moaning of the animals as they slammed into the ground below. Right now the jump is about 10 meters high. It would have been somewhat higher in the past. And you can imagine what that would have looked like. These flying animals just smashing into the earth, landing on top of each other, rolling, groaning, bleeding, tumbling down the hill on top of each other, more and more coming down on top. It would have been an unbelievable sight and an unbelievable sound. And in a few moments, it would have all been over. And then, as the herd had finally all reached the final kill and gone over the top of the cliff, that's when the killing would begin of those animals that had not died from the fall, which would have been probably fairly numerous. You would have animals that came late and landed on top of others. By the luck of the draw, just didn't happen to break any bones or shatter anything, and they're up and they're moving. And it's the job of the hunters to make sure they try and kill all those animals. That was one fairly common trait among Plains tribes, was that they tried to kill all the animals and not let any escape. And the reason is very interesting. It has nothing to do with getting more meat or procuring more animals or thinking you need more food. It has to do with the belief that these animals are cognizant beings, maybe in ways that we don't attribute them to today through Western science, but that they were cognitive in that they just understood what had happened to them. They had been through this remarkable trap that was very ingeniously laid out and had tricked them into coming over this cliff. And if they live through that and they go back to another herd and mingle in, the existence of those traps, that knowledge is going to be passed on to other buffalo. So it was really important to kill them all, to make sure that secret that they had just been through was not transferred onto other herds, because what that would do is that would then ruin kills in the future time. So you can imagine now maybe 100 animals have gone over a cliff on average, and they are at the bottom of this cliff. The native people have tried to kill all of those that they could. They use spears, they use clubs, they use bow and arrows. They would, in some cases, have to get in very close proximity, smashing skulls on the animals to dispatch them. I'm sure people got hurt occasionally, and there were injuries. People might have even died if they'd gotten pushed over the cliff from time to time. But now what they had to deal with was this massive amount of food in the form of meat, fat, also hide and bone. All of this is what is going to subsist them for many, many months to come. And the critical thing now, of course, is to process this in a way that makes the greatest use of all that food before it spoils. I was once calculating how much meat, fat, hide, bone is lying at the bottom of the cliff when a buffalo jump was completed. And the amount is staggering, because you're talking 50 to 100 animals weighing anywhere from 400 to 800 kilograms. And you add that up and multiply it, and you're talking tens and tens of thousands of kilograms of food. And as I thought about that, I realized nowhere else in human history have people produced that amount of food at any one time, whether it be agriculture or the killing of the biggest animals that have ever lived. The bowhead whale was the largest traditionally hunted animal on Earth. People have hunted mammoths and mastodons, elephants, giraffes, herds of caribou. Nothing would be comparable to the amount of food you produced at a buffalo jump in literally almost the blink of an eye. And when you go back 4 million years in human evolution, that's a pretty amazing thing. It's right here at our feet. We're standing right in front of it. The greatest food-getting enterprise human beings have ever devised. Once the killing of the animals was over, in many senses, the really hard work would begin. Because now you have all these carcasses laying here. You have to deal with this, and it's a massive amount of food and hide and fat and bone. And you have to process this in a way that is going to maximize the longevity of how that food can be used for months and months of time after these people walk away from here. Otherwise, all you're doing is having a few immediate feasts of great food, but that's not the long-term survival plan for this. So they would move between the carcasses and take them apart in ways that is going to enhance the preservation of the meat and the fat. And they did that in this assembly line fashion of cutting them apart, splaying the hides out on the ground, and spilling the stomach contents. And once they've done that, the carcasses would start to cool down quite quickly. And that is a huge help in terms of the preservation of the meat and the fat and the hide and the bone, all the material that you want to take away. Now, these are big animals and they're heavy. They weigh hundreds of kilograms. Individuals can't lug these things around, so they need to break them down into movable pieces. One of the great things about Head Smashed In is that the kill site is uphill from where your camp and your processing site is going to be. So you have gravity working for you. You can drag these things downslope. We think they probably cut them in quarters or so, major chunks of meat, and then you can use the hide as basically a sled and drag that down the slope with the chunks of meat on it. And here, once you get down to the bottom, you've got all this level land to work with. You've got flat ground, you've got water source, and you can spread out, which you can't do up at the kill site. And you can create many, many fires and many roasting and cooking pits out here. And this is where you have room to spread out and butcher these animals. And you're talking days of work here. This is not something a few hours and you're gone. If you've killed anywhere from, say, 75 to 100 animals, you have many, many days of work on your hand to render these down to usable products. The major things that they would do is they would strip the meat into thin sections and get them up on racks to dry. And one of the reasons for doing that is to get the weight of the meat down. Bison meat, like any meat, is primarily water. And when you strip it and hang it on a windy rack in the sun, the environment out here, it's going to dry very quickly and it's going to lose anywhere to 60% of its weight or so. And when you're people traveling on foot and you're carrying everything you own, that's a big, big deal. You're taking away thousands of kilograms of food from here, but you need to get rid of things you don't need to carry, like water that makes up the meat. The other thing that water does that's not good for meat is it causes spoilage. As long as the meat is wet and it's hanging there, flies can land on it and lay their eggs, bacteria can form on it. So the drying of the meat also is a means of preserving it. It's just like making jerky today, only without the salt. When people moved down to the flats here below the cliff, bringing these portions of the carcass with them, they had many, many things they had to do in order to render these animals now useful for long-term food supply. And a lot of that involved boiling and cooking of various types. They had many fires going here. They would use wood, they would use buffalo chips, which are a very good fuel once they're dried. They would dig holes in the ground, and one of the ways they cooked was they excavate these holes in the ground and then push a fresh bison hide into the hole with the skin side up and the hair side down. And what that does is it forms a watertight basin. So you can then get water from this natural spring channel, which was always here and always flowing. And you can bring water to these kettles in the ground that you've just dug. You can fill them up, and that becomes a cooking basin. So if you ask yourself, how did these people cook? They didn't have stoves. They couldn't put pots on top of a fire. They dug holes in the ground, and then what they did was they brought the heat to the pit by heating rocks in a fire nearby, and then lifting those rocks up with forked sticks, carrying them over to the pits of water and dropping them in. And it would be a big hissing sound, and the water would crackle and boil, and the rocks would get cool. They'd lift them out, they'd put hot rocks, more hot rocks in from the fire, and keep doing that as a cycle of moving in hot rocks, taking the cool ones out. And pretty soon the water boils. So we've done this as an experiment. We know that it works. You can get boiling water in about 20 minutes, and then you can add chunks of meat, you could add sections of ribs and roasts, and boil up any kind of a stew and a soup that you would like, and you can consume it on the spot. But another thing they would do for long-term preservation, they would use these cooking pits to boil bones in them. And the reason to boil bones is because the buffalo bones are really quite greasy. They have a lot of grease, fat in the bone, and that's a highly desirable trait that the people wanted to preserve. It's what helps keep you alive in difficult times. Not lean meat, but in fact fatty meat is what will save your life. And they knew that, and so they went to great lengths to get the fat out of the bones. They would smash them into very small pieces using rocks and anvils, and then they would throw those bone chips into these cooking pits that I just described. With the hot rocks in them, keeping the water boiling, they would fill them up with these broken bone chips. And what happens is the boiling water works all around the bone like a solvent, and it brings the fat out of the bone, and it comes to the surface of the water. Just like if you boil soup bones in the pot in your stove and let it cool, you will get a skim of the grease on the top of the water. And the very same thing happened here thousands of years ago. They boil these bone chips, and then they would skim that grease off. And one of the most important uses of grease from bones was making of pemmican. And pemmican was a really critical food resource because it provided them with a food that would last for many months when they walked away from a buffalo jump. And that was critical for survival through the winter months. Now, pemmican is dried meat that's been smashed and pounded into almost a powder, but critical to that is the adding of fat. And the most important fat that was used in making of pemmican was fat that they rendered from the bones. It was really high quality, and it lasted a long time, more so than body fat, chunks of fat off of meat. They preferred the bone fat for making pemmican, and that's why there's so many smashed bones out here and so many cooking pits, because people were making enormous amounts of pemmican that they could then carry away with them to their winter camps. The season of the buffalo jump was variable, but also it had strong tendencies. You could get buffalo jumps in the springtime. They were relatively rare. The animals are not in great shape coming through winter. They haven't eaten a lot of high quality food. Their bodies are not in great shape in terms of meat and fat because they have been through the extremes of winter. But in the spring, the grass is starting to green up, the food is getting better, and buffalo jumps were executed in the spring, often to obtain quality hides. Because what happens is the hide of the buffalo actually gets thinner through the winter months because the animals actually absorb some of that as food. They're absorbing portions of their own hide. So if you measure a buffalo hide in the early fall and winter, it's actually thicker than it is in the spring when it has lost some of its thickness. And sometimes people wanted those thinner hides. For example, making teepees required people to sew together many different hides to make a teepee. And sewing the thickest hides of the animal from the fall and winter was extremely hard work. Instead, they would often wait till the spring months and kill animals that then had a thinner hide, and they would sew those hides together because it was a lot easier work and the hides didn't weigh nearly as much. You also have to drag these around everywhere you go. But most of the jumps were fall events. And the reason for that is because fall is the key season for when buffalo are in absolutely prime condition. At least the cows and the calves are. Bulls, not so much. But we know that cows were the primary target anyway for almost all bison kills. Cows were the primary target because they were the fatter of the two sexes for most of any one year. Bulls were by far heavier. They're larger animals. They weigh more. But the cow, even though it weighs less than the bull, will have absolutely more fat on it, a greater weight of fat than a bull will. And that was really important to these people. It's hard to stress in our modern lives where we kind of shun fat and we see it as a bad thing. The truth is you need it to survive, and without it you will die. We just get it from so many other sources we're not aware of. But these people were very aware of all the sources where they got fat. And of course, they weren't getting it from vegetable material. They weren't getting it from berries. They were getting it from animal products. And for the bison, the key fat source was really cows. They are by far the fattest of the two animals. And when the cows are the fattest is in the fall. They have gone through the summer months. Many of them were nursing a calf that's lactating. It's draining your body resources. You don't have as much meat and fat on you when you're lactating as when you are not. And most of the cows would be lactating any one year. They normally would calf every year. So they are lactating, and now they're gaining fat and body weight back over the course of the summer, and by fall, they are in top form. In the months of September, October, at least on the northern plains here, these animals would be in peak form, and this is the prime time for killing them. So most of the buffalo jumps and buffalo pounds, most of the great kills, were killing of calves and cows that went with them, and not that many bulls. The bulls were rather undesirable. They were regarded as tougher meat. They had a stronger taste to them. And of course, if you got them in late summer or fall, they are going through the rut period, which is when they're trying to mate with the females, and they become increasingly unpleasantly tasting. They get a musky, kind of rancid smell and taste to the meat because of all these hormones that are pumping through them. And they were regarded as very poor food. This was true of indigenous hunters, and soon the Europeans who arrived and started hunting bison made all the same comments in their journals. They said the males are unedible at this time of year. They're just rank and tasteless, and they've lost all their fat. See, the males would lose their fat because they're fighting over dominance of the females, and the females, meanwhile, are gaining fat because they're just grazing on good quality feed and they're getting ready for the winter months. So they're building up their fat reserves. So many things combine to make fall the ideal time for the great communal kills, including but not limited to buffalo jumps. And Head Smash In is a good example of that. In the cases where we know the season of the kill, and we can't always tell it, but we can, from some of the bones, we can determine what season the kill event happened. The great majority of cases we can do that, we can show that these were fall time events. People would have spent days out here on the plains cooking, roasting, getting ready to move away from this site. Head Smashed In was not the kind of place you wanted to camp for any length of time after the main job of butchering the buffalo was over. You're out in the open, you're exposed, it's windy, winter is likely coming, assume it was a fall kill. You need to go somewhere where you can be protected from the elements and where you have wood that's a very needed commodity for winter fires. So this was an industrial site. Think of it that way. They butchered and processed hundreds of carcasses out here, thousands over many thousands of years, and then they would move away to sheltered areas. We think it was primarily the river valley of the Oldman River, which is only 2 kilometers away from the Buffalo Jump. So it's pretty easy striking distance. You can drag all the food and belongings that you have here down to the Oldman without too much trouble. And there, once you're there, you can drop down into the valley bottom, and you're protected from the elements because you've got the valley sides on both sides of you. You've got wood of cottonwood trees all throughout the valley of the Oldman, and so you've got a ready source of wood, which is really critical for winter fires. If you think about it, you can burn buffalo chips for cooking and heating, but they don't produce anywhere near the heat of a wood fire, especially if you're inside a teepee over the course of the winter where there's very little wind. You need a wood fire to stay alive, really. So people moved to wood sources for the winter. And also, if you think about it, Head Smash In would not be a very pleasant place to be after a buffalo kill had finished. People have butchered and cut up hundreds of animals here. There's much grease and fat and blood spilled into the soil. There's chunks of meat laying around that are of no use anymore, that have maybe been cooked and boiled and eaten. And it's going to attract a lot of unsavory characters. Coyotes and wolves would be moving in, potentially grizzly bears, certainly birds of prey, feeding off all of this. It would be a place that would be rather unpleasant to be for any length of time. So for the reasons I've mentioned about the climate here and the predators, you would want to get out of here relatively quickly. So we think they moved out of here within a week or so of butchering the bison, probably moved to winter camps in the Oldman River Valley, and that was where they would then take the tens of thousands of pounds of belongings that they have produced of food sources and hides and things like that, take that with them and then further process them there. They wouldn't do all of it here because some of it takes a great deal of, for example, tanning hides can take a great deal of time, and you wouldn't necessarily stay here and do that on the grounds of the Buffalo Jump. You would take those to your camps that are more long-term and tan the hides there. And these would be essential for winter robes, for blankets, for teepee covers, for some of the clothing that people wore. Bison hides were a critical resource, and they made sure to tan them all and use them all in a very productive way. So Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump is one of the most thoroughly dated archaeological sites in all of Canada. We have hundreds of radiocarbon dates from this site, so we have a very good idea of the use of it through time. And it is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, buffalo jump known anywhere on the Great Plains. There's one site in Texas, it's somewhat controversial. The age of the site is probably 10,000 years, and that is relatively firm. What's not firm is whether or not it's actually a buffalo jump. There's a debate about that. It hasn't been resolved at this point. If it is not a jump, and many people think it is not, if it is not, then this is the oldest buffalo jump by far. Head Smashed In has dates going back as far as 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, although we're not positive that people were actually driving buffalo over the cliff at those early dates. They were clearly here on this landscape. Although by 6,500 years ago, we know for a fact that people were driving bison over the cliff at Head Smashed In. That's older than Stonehenge, that's older than the building of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. So it's a remarkable story transpiring at a very early time in human settlement of the North American continent. And yet clearly they had mastered that technique because we have the bone remains from extensive drives of bison 6,500 years ago. After that, they kept using the site for many thousands of years. There is a gap of about 1,000 years where it appears they did not use the jump, and we don't know why. They may have just simply moved away. The climate may have changed. The bison herds may have changed. Or it's suggested that different people arrived on the scene who simply didn't use the buffalo jump. They had other ways of hunting buffalo, and they certainly subsisted on that animal, but they did not drive them over a cliff. But beginning about 3,000 years ago, people resumed their use of head smashed in, and then really it entered what we would call its heyday or its fluorescence. The campsite was used primarily from about 2,000 years ago onward, and that use of it was very intensive. It became almost an industrial site here, people possibly even overproducing what they needed for their own use, so they could use it for trade of materials from far distant regions from southern Alberta. And we have some evidence of that. We believe bison food and bison hides were being traded into like the middle Missouri Valley of North America for exchange of goods like stone tools that they needed and other materials that they wanted, shells from various oceans and coasts that they could not access here. We have evidence of that going on, stone that comes from exotic sources, and we know where it was being brought in from. So the campsite was really intensified about 2,000 years ago. People were cooking and roasting and boiling everything that they brought down from the kill. They were not doing that much of that in the early use of the site, and we're not sure why. But the early uses of the jump were more confined to the kill site, and the later uses did a lot more spreading down onto the campsite and really thoroughly butchering these animals. And that took place starting about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, and then continued right up to the time of European contact. We do have some European goods here. There are a few metal items found at the site, a few glass beads, things that indicate that Native people kept coming here after they had contact with Europeans. Head smashed in, and really all the major buffalo jumps started falling into disuse with the arrival of Europeans and them bringing with them horses and guns.
The buffalo or bison, of course, is very important to indigenous people, indigenous culture, indigenous spirituality because of what it provided for the people. We call him Nimosomnan, or our grandfather, and that gives us a kinship to the buffalo, and we are related to the buffalo as well as other animal species as well, the winged ones, the ones that crawl on the ground, everything is related. But the buffalo, of course, is central to a lot of the lifestyle because they provided the material for clothing, shelter, even the fuel for the fires out on the prairies. There isn't very much wood on some of the prairie lands, so the buffalo dung was used to provide for fire. I had an elder once said to me that you haven't tasted food until you've had food cooked over buffalo dung, and I don't know if I tried it. But anyway, it was something that they had done for survival for thousands, and literally thousands of years. The methods, of course, of dispatching or getting the buffalo varied. In pre-equestrian days, of course, they had the surround method, surrounding the bison, and the buffalo pound method. An elder at Muscatine Cultural College described what occurred when they had the ceremony for the buffalo pound. That there would be elders that would do a ceremony at the entrance of the pit of the pound. There would be a pit, and they would do a lot of prayer, smudge, and singing. They would sing songs, the buffalo calling songs. Some elders or spiritual men were gifted with those songs, and they would sing those ceremonially before the actual attempt to bring in the buffalo. So runners would be sent out who would call the buffalo. They would locate the buffalo, and when they located a herd, they would wave, kind of make a waving with some robes or something to get their attention, and then they would turn and run and attract the buffalo to follow them. They would lead them towards the pound, and they would go faster, running faster and faster. And along the way, there would be like a funnel type of layout. Sometimes they put cairns of rocks or something that would ensure that the buffalo go into the direction they want. And then there would be people hiding out along the sides as well, who would often jump up as the buffalo went past and make them run faster. And rather than a straight line, it would kind of curve towards where the pound is. And from there, the elder said they tied these birch wood, because it's a hardwood, kind of like a ramp. And they would run up that ramp, and then they would go inside the pound itself. And I have heard that they always went clockwise. They would always gallop clockwise. And while they were in there, they made these high walls, kind of covered with hide as well, so they can't see the other side. And they would be run in a circle, and from there they would dispatch the buffalo. Another elder at that same interview said that they didn't use firearms because that was a bit more dangerous. Crossfire might hit, somebody on the other side if you missed an animal. So they were concentrated mainly on arrows, bows and arrows and spears and so on. And eventually, when all the animals were dispatched, there would be another exit or another door where they would take out the meat and the buffalo robes and the hides and everything. They would take out. So they'd come in at one door and they would take them out another exit. So that was how they described it. Another elder said that he heard a story about how this one particular buffalo was very angry, and he just kept bellowing and pawing the ground. And they said so many arrows, that this buffalo wore so many arrows before they were finally able to take it down. So basically that was the other method. Of course, the other method is the horseback. Once people were able to get horses, then they would do the buffalo run. And particular horses were valued. They were very valued because of their skills of being able to run up as close as they can to the buffalo and then move away, so you don't move away from the danger, because bison are dangerous animals. When you see the tail go up, get out of there. It means they're going to charge. But in any event, there would be, because their hands were busy with the bow and arrow, they would get as close as they can. And rather, the elder said they didn't pull it back like this. And it's thumb forefinger draw. They didn't have the English three-finger draw, thumb forefinger. It was more like this, to get as close to the buffalo as possible. And often, sometimes the bows were so powerful that the arrows would go right through the animal. I have heard that the timing was important, and everything happened so fast, but you had to try and release your arrow when they were making the forward stride, and that the ribs would be further apart. It'd be a lot easier for the arrow to go through. Eventually, and some of them, they would use guns. There's actually Palliser, when they did the exploration in the 1850s, along the South Saskatchewan, Palliser had come across Maskipton, one of the Cree chiefs. That's one of our ancestors from Musqueam. And they went on a buffalo run. And after they were done, Maskipton realized he lost his ramrod. They called those guns kamostipichtaso, like they were muzzle loaders. And he couldn't find his ramrod. So he retraced his steps all the way back where his horse had galloped. Nothing, he couldn't find it. And when he got back, the women were butchering the animals. Lo and behold, the ramrod was in one of the buffalo. Apparently he forgot to take it out and shot it through the buffalo. So that's a documented story written by John Palliser in his expeditions. So sometimes they would use firearms, but for the most part I think they used bows and arrows. The pounds I understand were sometimes occurred mostly in the wintertime, or in areas where there would be large gatherings of people, because you'd need a cooperation by numerous people. And if you're able to bring in that many animals, of course there'd be a lot of meat, sometimes surplus meat. So certainly there would be wintering sites where there would be pounds close by. I think there was one here in Hardisty, not too far. There were numerous areas, and usually the landscape had to be conducive for you're able to successfully lead those buffalo in that area with the landscape kind of being in such a way that that's the natural direction that they go towards. And sometimes towards the end it'll be kind of a sloping down, so they can't really go back or to be. That's the direction that they're going. Maybe gravity and inertia, it's what's taking them there. So certainly a lot of people would be participating in such an event. Some of the early explorers in their documents described it as a cacophony of bellowing sound, blood and dust, and it was just quite the event, so to speak. And one can imagine all the excitement, because now you're going to get food, and not just some food, but lots of food. So there'd be opportunity to feast, have a storytelling, have people come and visit, share the meat, take some of the robes and decide which may be used for buffalo robes, or some that would be totally skinned to be used for teepee cover or clothing, moccasins, and so on. The bones, of course, marrow was a delicacy. People loved marrow. The buffalo tongue was another delicacy. The hump. All these different parts of the buffalo was utilized and distributed and taken, and people would make it into a celebratory event.